Okay, everybody, here we go with chapter 1. This is for the 10th edition of the textbook, so hopefully you have a copy of the book that is pictured here. But just to give you a little background, did you know that the longest word in the dictionary is actually a medical term? Let me attempt to say it here. Pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis, which basically means that you are having a lung issue thanks to the volcanic ash that has been spilled into the sky. Don't worry, you're never going to be tested or have to spell such a thing, but at the bottom we have more of a term that you will need to know. Esophagogastroduodenoscopy. And at this point in the game you might be saying to yourself, oh my god, this is never going to happen. But we're going to learn the small pieces as kind of color-coded in different colors that make up these words, and then you're going to learn to kind of mix and match them to make whatever word you need. Chapter 1, the one you're listening to right now, is probably one of the most important chapters in the whole book because it's really going to organize and help you understand how medical terms are broken down. It's just like learning a new language. There are word roots, or root words, if you've heard it that way before, which are the core of the word. And then we have prefixes and suffixes that we can kind of tack on to those core words. And with that, you can make new and different words. And there's going to be some rules about how and when you put those together. So if we can figure that out in chapter 1, then as we work through the rest of the chapters in the book, you're going to start to get more and more pieces so you can mix and match and build even more words that go along with it. I will point out right now that you will be responsible for also spelling all of these words correctly. So if you spell words incorrectly on the exam, then you will get some points taken away. Sad but true, because the difference in, one letter in a word might be a different condition, for example. I did link out a video kind of to show you how to get to the online resources and how to utilize that. I highly recommend it. I'm not usually a fan of textbook resources, but this one is actually pretty good. So under the General Resources tab in Buzz, you kind of will find the video that goes along with that. And this is what it kind of brings you to. When you finally get yourself in, it brings you to a screen that looks like this. And you'll see that it's organized by chapter on the left. So if you're working on a specific chapter, then you would just click on that. There is an option for you to kind of mix and match all chapters together at the end, which will be helpful when you're studying for the final. But you can see there's quizzes. If you're not savvy in the anatomy and physiology, there's a little booster that kind of goes into some background. If you prefer electronic flashcards to the paper ones, that's an option as well. Pronunciation, games, I think the games are really helpful, as you're studying for the test. And then there's health records, which kind of shows you what real health records might look like and puts the medical terms you're using into a little bit of context. So the first thing that we're going to learn is, where do these words even come from? And there's a couple different categories of words. In this case, there are, for example, eponyms. Eponym is a way to name something after a person. I think I skipped ahead on accident. So any time you see an eponym, it's named after someone famous. In this case, it's talking about an APGAR score, which is something we use on newborn children. West Nile virus is named after the place it's been found. You can think of Huntington disease. ALS is also called Lou Gehrig's disease. There's tons and tons and tons. So if it's named after a person or a place, then it's an eponym. An acronym is something that we see all the time. It's where you take a really long phrase or series of words and just use the first letter of each one of those to make a new, shorter, easier word. And if you didn't know, laser is actually an acronym. It means light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, which is why we say laser, because that's too crazy long. You can think of, let's see, other ones that might come into play, like an ENT is way shorter than saying the long drawn out medical term, or an EMT. We'll see tons of them along the way. Another category is called modern language. So as you'll see on the next slide what most medical terms come from, we do have a category where just with our modern English that we are using today in the world, we just start naming things with words that we're using today, like a nuclear medicine scanner. Obviously that didn't exist, hundreds of years ago, so it's under the modern medical language category. What you'll find is that most words actually come from Greek or Latin origin, which is where the formal medical language began. Throughout the textbook, you're actually going to find these little boxes in blue that look like this right here, for example, chromosome, and it kind of tells you why something was named that. Oftentimes in medical terms, you see a word for something and you can't make a connection as to why it was ever named that in the first place. So those bubbles just kind of give you a little idea. But most of the words that we're going to see, everything that's built from these little word parts we're going to learn about, mostly come from Greek or Latin origin. All right, so here's an example. Looking at number 1, hepatitis. Hepatitis is built from Latin or word parts. AIDS stands for autoimmunodeficiency syndrome. That is an example of an acronym. Robotic surgery would be an example of modern language. And now we have Zika, or the Zika virus, which is an eponym because it's named after something. So I want you to just think for a moment, as many eponyms as maybe you could think of, and write them down. You should probably be able to come up with at least 5 to 10, just off the top of your head. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think of some eponyms. Hopefully you were able to at least come up with a few. I mentioned some previously: Alzheimer's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, Huntington disease. I'm trying to think of more off the top of my head. Don't forget places like West Nile. But there's plenty to choose from. Okay. So we have the origin of where these words are coming from, and now we're going to separate them into 2 key categories. One you're going to like and one you're not going to like. All medical terms are either going to be built from word parts or not built from word parts. Seems pretty silly, but the built from word part ones are going to be the ones that you like. These are the ones that the book comes with flashcards for. The blue ones are not, and those are the ones that you're just going to kind of either need to make your own flashcards for or straight up memorize. And I'll show you what those look like as we move forward. So here in your book, I take a lot of graphics from the book. This is from the first table, and it kind of gives you a breakdown. So the ones that are built from word parts are those Greek and Latin terms. And they're meant to, once you understand the parts, you can mix and match and make tons and tons and tons of words. You literally translate the meaning of the word to get the condition or disease. So for example, arthritis literally means inflammation of the joint. So you just have to look at the parts and define them. The second category, terms not built from word parts, is not very easy. These are those other categories, the eponyms, like Alzheimer's disease. Just looking at that, you would not necessarily understand what that even means. An acronym. MRSA is an acronym. And again, you might look at that and not have any idea what those letters actually stand for. In this case, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Modern language, like a complete blood count and differential, which if you watch medical shows, that would be a CBC panel for your complete blood count. And then there's also some that are kind of loosely built on Greek or Latin, but not super easy, like orthopedics. Sounds like it comes from Latin. It has Latin pieces, but you can't just directly translate. So that's the category of tricky ones that are going to be a little bit more difficult. Okay, so thinking about this, Parkinson disease, built from word parts or not built from word parts? I'm hoping you're saying not built from word parts because this would be an example of an eponym named after a person. Whereas osteoarthritis would be considered built from word parts. Because we can chop that up, and I'll show you how to do that, to literally mean inflammation of the bone and the joint. So, before we can start chopping big long words up, we need to know what pieces there are and how to go about doing that. So, here are your 4 key pieces. And this seems maybe a little bit silly, a little bit easy, but if you don't get this basic stuff down, then you're going to have a whole lot of trouble learning the medical terms. The first is the word root, and that's the core of the word, the true center or fundamental meaning. And that could apply to a whole lot of things. So, for example, on the previous slide, we had arthritis. Arthur is a word root. It means joint. Well, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with your joint. So that's your core meaning. And then we can tack on prefixes and suffixes to kind of change that meaning a little bit. So a prefix is a piece that goes in the beginning of the word, and the suffix is a piece that goes at the end. So for example, when I said arthritis, itis means inflammation of. Well, a lot of things in your body can be inflamed. So if you stick that ending onto any other word root, it means inflammation of whatever you're talking about. So if I said arthritis, then I'm talking about inflammation of the joint. If I said arthroplasty, then that would mean I'm doing surgical repair of the joint. So it just depends on what suffix you might be adding on or prefix, and we'll see those later. The last one is called a combining vowel. I would say 99% of the time that's going to be an O. And that's just added in there so that when we have to say these words out loud, it's easier to say. A lot of these word roots and prefixes and suffixes are chock full of consonants, and so they don't really roll off the tongue, so to speak. So sometimes we add in a vowel just to make it sound and flow a little better. And there are going to be some rules for that, and I'll share that with you in a minute. So, word root, as I mentioned, is the core of the word. Most medical terms have at least one. It's kind of hard to make a word that doesn't have a core or middle. They can have more than one. For example, osteoarthritis has 2. Oste and arthur are both word roots. The word at the bottom, in this case, onc, O-N-C, which means tumor, is a word root. The combining form, in this case, we stuck an O in there to make it flow a little better. So this word is an oncologist. Oncologist does not sound very good. So we need to stick that O in there to make it a little bit easier. The combining form, which is what we're going to see in the context of the textbook and exams, is what you see in black here at the bottom. Onc is the word root, and then you see a slash and an O. The combining form is when you have the word root and the combining vowel together. So you would say this is onco. That means tumor, or a lot of times means cancer, like the oncologist would be the cancer doctor. So that's the combining form, onco. Whenever in your book it's going to ask you for the combining form, it's going to want something like that. Logist is actually a suffix, and it means a person who studies. So when you stick that onto the end of certain words, then that person is studying whatever the topic has to be. Here's another example, as I just mentioned. Itis as a suffix, which goes at the end, means inflammation. So in this word, hepat means liver. So hepatitis is inflammation of the liver. And I'll teach it a little bit more clearly, but notice how when I'm defining these words, I'm starting at the end. Inflammation of the liver. I'm starting at the end and then I'm going backwards to say, this is my condition or what's happening, and then I say where it's happening. But not all words have a suffix, so just note that not everything has to have a suffix or a prefix. Some have one or the other, some have both, some have none. Here's an example of a prefix, and prefixes are meant to give a little bit more clarity to where something is. In this case, venous means pertaining to the vein, and intra means within. So this word put together means pertaining to within the vein. And if you didn't know, IV, if you get an IV, it's an abbreviation of this word. IV means intravenous, meaning inside your veins, so to speak. So in your book on page 9, there is a table that looks just like this. And this is kind of the guidelines for when do you put a vowel in versus not put a vowel in, because you don't throw it everywhere all of the time. And it's going to be hard in the beginning, but as we start to move through chapters, you're going to feel more and more comfortable and it'll just become automatic. It's just hard because you're looking at this for the very first time. So if you have a word root like Arthur and a suffix, pathy, which means in this case disease, a combining vowel is used as long as the suffix doesn't already have a vowel. So if your suffix doesn't start with a vowel already, you put one in there to ease pronunciation. So arthropathy would be a disease of the joint. If the suffix already does start with a vowel, then you don't need to add an extra one in. Then you have too many vowels. So this would be hepatic, pertaining to the liver. If you have more than one word root, you use a vowel, even if it already starts with one. So in this case, osti is a word root, Arthur is a word root. Even though Arthur starts with an A, we're still going to put an O there. So osteoarthritis would be the medical term that you would make. Prefixes do not get vowels after them. So subhepatic. If it starts with a vowel or doesn't start with a vowel, it doesn't matter. After a prefix, you do not put a combining vowel there. So subhepatic in this case would mean pertaining to under, sub means under, like a submarine, under the liver. All right. Again, it's on page 9 in your book if you want to tab it or flag it to kind of get you a little more comfortable. So as I've been working through some of these words, here's a couple more examples. We're going to learn them explicitly throughout the book, but just to give you an idea of what some of these look like, at the top we have the word roots that we have been using. Then there's some prefixes, suffixes, and then combining vowels. So the part that is the core or the root of the word is what? Hopefully you're saying word root. That's the main part of the word, or the general, area that you're talking about, whether it's the bone or the joint or the liver or so on. If vowels are present in between two word roots, a combining vowel is used. So do you put an O between those or not? Do you put two O's or do you put an I? Well, certainly cross off C because you should never use two O's. But the correct answer is A. You should put an O between two word roots even if the second one starts with a vowel already. Okay, so now we're to the point now where you at least know what parts are. We're going to start to try to figure out what words mean. There's this tricky chart in your book. It is located, I'm trying to figure out where it is, on page 14 for you. That kind of goes through and teaches you how to take a word and figure out what it means. And it's kind of a long process. You don't always have to do it this way. The first thing is to take your really long word and chop it up into pieces. I totally recommend taking a pencil on your workbook and, when you get a long word, cutting it up, putting actual slashes so you can break up the parts. If you see it all together as one long word, it gets a little scary. So in this case, I've chopped it up. It recommends that you label them. So in terms of labeling, WR stands for word root, CV is combining vowel, S is for suffix. If you see a P somewhere, then that means prefix. Oh, it went too far. Sorry. Back to where we were. If you see CF, then that means that it's a combining form. So you'll notice that when you put the word root together with the vowel, it's a combining form. You can do all this labeling, but you don't really have to. It's kind of up to you. You might do it at the beginning and then realize that you don't really need to do it after a while because you got it kind of memorized. Once you have it chopped up into bits, then you actually define each part. So as I mentioned before, when we're defining a word, we actually start at the end. You start by defining the suffix. So in this case, pathy means disease of. So when you're writing your definition, you would start with disease of. So once you do the end, then you hop back all the way to the beginning. You do not work your way from the back to the front. You just start at the back and then hop your way to the beginning and work your way down. So in this case, we have bone and joint. So when you're defining it and putting it all together, it would be disease of the bone and the joint. So that's how you take a word and you chop it up into pieces and define it. But you also need to be able to take a definition and build the word that you need. So you kind of just do the opposite. When you're given a definition, the first part of a definition is telling you the suffix. So in a definition, if I see disease of, well, I know that's pathy, and pathy is the suffix. So you would put that at the end. And then I also see the words bone and joint. So I know that I need to have osti, and I know that I need to have Arthur. And then at the very end, you decide whether or not you need to add in some O's to make it flow. In this case, between two word roots, you do add one. And because my suffix over here doesn't have a vowel already, I need to add that second O to combine to make that word. So when you're building a word, the first part of the definition is the suffix, and then the rest of it goes in the front. Now, notice how there's two word roots here. Usually you just order them in the order that you read the definition. So I put Asti first and Arthur second because that's the order in the definition. Technically, you could flip-flop these and it could be equally correct. I could have said arthro-osteopathy. It's just not the one in common use. So for common practice, I would say just follow the order that is the definition. Okay, so for example here in arthritis, I would say first you would take your word and then you would make your little slash line and then you would define it. So first you make your slash. You can label it if you feel like you want to label it. And then you start defining at the end. Itis means inflammation, arthro means joint, so together it means inflammation of the joint. All right, looking at this review question, which one of these words is actually split up and labeled correctly? Take a minute. Hopefully, you have arrived at B is the correct answer. A is not correct because pathy is one suffix. You don't chop the Y off. C is incorrect because Arthur is a word root and not a prefix. I'm never going to have you, do this specifically on a test, but you need to know how to do this to be able to do the things on the test. All right. I kind of already gave you the definition at the very beginning, but now that we have this big, long, crazy word, we can actually break it down and define it. So you can see how in this word we've kind of color-coded each section. So you would kind of put a slash in between each one of the different color areas. There is a difference in color between volcano and Connie. But then you would go through and define each part. Pneumono means lung, ultra, extreme, microscopic, silico, volcano, Connie, osis. You'll see in parentheses, we are going to actually learn most of these parts in the different chapters as we work through the book. Not all of them. We don't explicitly teach volcano, but I'm sure using your context clues, you can figure it out. So when we put it all together, you start at the end with osis, which means abnormal condition, and then you jump to the front. So abnormal condition of the lung, brought on as a result of inhalation of pertaining to visual examination of extremely small particles of ash and silicate dust. Basically, you have a lung infection because you inhaled volcanic ash, is the layman's terms of saying what happened there. Okay, so now we're going to build some terms. For example, on the left, you can see what a normal knee joint looks like, or at least in a cartoon version. So you have your top bone, which is your femur, if you didn't know already. And then your bottom bones here, you have your tibia and fibula, and then the joint and all the cartilage that goes between them. Athletes, you might know this a little bit more from any injuries you may have had. On the right, you can see that the bone is not quite as smooth. It's a little bit of jagged edges. It's thickened on one side. You have some cysts here. So bad news, generally. But we're going to call this inflammation of both the bone and the joint. So then this term would end up being osteoarthritis. And that's how you would put that together. Okay, so in the Buzz General Resources, I've linked out this awesome dictionary. Again, I think it's going to be really helpful because it's not your traditional dictionary. It's specific to medical words. So it will give you the actual medical definition as well as pronunciation. It's up here at the top as well if you feel like it's going to be helpful to you. At the very end of the chapter, here's a picture of some more of the online resources to help you if you need. Watch that separate video if you find it helpful. And that is the end of chapter 1. You are now ready to learn real medical terminology.